So we've learned what blood pressure is and how we can measure that clinically by checking blood pressure with a sphygmomanometer. So let's talk a little bit about how to maintain blood pressure. As we mentioned a while ago, our body has built-in homeostatic mechanisms that can compensate for small changes in blood pressure. Those small changes can be fixed by simply altering cardiac output or peripheral resistance. So if you change how much blood is coming back into the heart by altering venous return, or change heart rate, increase or decrease heart rate, you're going to change cardiac output, and that of course is going to increase or decrease the mean arterial pressure. You can also have a short-term fix by just changing peripheral resistance. Remember, resistance is the opposition to blood flow due to the friction of the blood flow against the walls of the vessels that it's flowing in. So vasoconstriction and vasodilation is going to alter peripheral resistance. But long-term control of blood pressure means that we've got to call the kidneys into this job, right? So we've got to alter blood volume. So in this video, we'll look at some of the ways that we maintain blood pressure, both short-term or all short-term in this one, and then we'll move into long-term in the next video. So let's begin with looking at factors that increase or decrease peripheral resistance. So when you're looking at the resistance of the flow, of the blood flow pushing against the walls of the vessels that they're in, if the vessels change or if the blood changes, then obviously that's going to change the resistance. So first, if we think about how thick or how viscous the blood is, that's dependent mostly on how many red blood cells are in the plasma, and also just to a smaller extent the amount of proteins that are in the plasma. So if you have a condition known as polycythemia, remember that's going to cause blood to become more viscous. So the higher the viscosity, the higher the resistance. And of course with a higher resistance, that's going to increase blood pressure. Anything that causes a depletion of plasma proteins or erythrocytes, say maybe due to aplastic anemia or some type of hemolytic anemia or hemorrhage, you're losing blood, then the blood is going to become less viscous, and of course that will decrease blood pressure. Resistance to blood flow through a vessel is directly proportional to the length of the blood vessel. So the longer the vessel, the greater the resistance. People that are extremely overweight, obese people, often have hypertension, what we call high blood pressure, because of the additional blood vessels in their adipose tissue, and that increases their total blood vessel length. So the longer the length, the greater the resistance. And then blood vessel diameter. So when you're looking at a blood vessel, remember the blood is going to flow through the opening in the middle, what we call the lumen. So the smaller the lumen, the greater the resistance to flow, the greater the pressure. Vasoconstriction narrows the lumen and vasodilation widens it. So as arteries dilate, resistance decreases and blood pressure falls. As arteries constrict, resistance increases and pressure rises. So anything that increases resistance, peripheral resistance, vascular resistance, same thing, anything that increases the resistance is going to increase blood pressure. Anything that decreases resistance is going to decrease blood pressure. When we were talking about the heart and talking about blood, we talked about how the cardiovascular center in the medulla oblongata is going to help to regulate the heart rate and stroke volume. The cardiovascular system also controls neural, hormonal, and local negative feedback systems that help to regulate blood pressure and blood flow to specific tissues. So groups of neurons are scattered within the cardiovascular system, regulate heart rate, contractility, remember that's force of contraction of the ventricles, and blood vessel diameter. Some of the neurons stimulate the heart, and that's in the cardiostimulatory center. Others inhibit the heart in the cardioinhibitory center. So we're going to look at how the nervous system can alter blood vessel diameter, how it can alter the distribution of the blood, and the role of the vasomotor center, baroreceptors, chemoreceptors, and higher brain centers in these pathways. In the cardiovascular center in the medulla oblongata, we have an area that we call the vasomotor center. The vasomotor center is a cluster of sympathetic neurons in the medulla that can cause vasoconstriction or vasodilation. So output can flow along the sympathetic and parasympathetic neurons of the autonomic nervous system, and of course increase heart rate and contractility, as we've seen. But the cardiovascular center also continuously sends impulses out to the smooth muscle that's in the blood vessel walls through vasomotor nerves. And this goes out to arterioles throughout the body, but especially to those in the skin and the viscera of the abdomen. And the way that these are constantly getting that stimulation in the viscera or in the abdominal viscera and the skin keeps a moderate state of vasocontraction or constriction, and we call that vasomotor tone. Remember, baroreceptors are pressure-sensitive receptors. They're located, these baroreceptors that we're talking about with blood pressure are located in the aorta and in the internal carotid arteries. Those are the arteries in your neck that supply blood to the brain. There's also some of these in the large arteries in the neck and the chest. They send impulses to the cardiovascular center that help us to regulate blood pressure. The two most important baroreceptor reflexes are the carotid sinus reflex and the aortic reflex. So these baroreceptors are in the wall of the carotid sinus, which is in the carotid artery, and also in the wall of the ascending and the arch of the aorta. And of course, when these receptors are stretched, they send that information to the brain, and the cardiovascular center can make adjustments as needed for vasodilation and vasoconstriction. So when blood pressure falls, the baroreceptors are going to be stretched less, and they send nerve impulses at a slower rate to the cardiovascular system. So the cardiovascular system is going to decrease parasympathetic stimulation. And remember, parasympathetic is brake, so it's going to decrease the brake and increase the sympathetic, the accelerator, stimulation of the heart. And that, of course, is going to increase heart rate. Another thing that happens because of the increased sympathetic stimulation is secretion of epinephrine and norepinephrine by the adrenal medulla. So as heart rate increases and it's beating faster and more forcefully, the systemic vascular, excuse me, the vascular resistance increases because more blood is going out, right? Cardiac output has increased, and that causes resistance to rise, so blood pressure increases back to normal. When an increase on pressure is detected, on the other hand, those baroreceptors are going to send impulses at a faster rate. So the cardiovascular system responds by doing just the opposite. So it's going to increase the brake, the parasympathetic stimulation, and decrease the accelerator, the sympathetic stimulation. This is going to cause a decrease in heart rate and a decrease in the force of contraction. So what's that going to do? It's going to decrease cardiac output. The cardiovascular system slows the rate that it's sending out the sympathetic impulses that would cause vasoconstriction. So all this results in lower vascular resistance, lower peripheral resistance. The decreased cardiac output and the decreased resistance both lower the arterial pressure back to normal. Pretty cool, huh? There is a condition that happens sometimes in the elderly. So let me set you up for what's happening here. So when you're lying down and you sit up really quickly or stand up really quickly, this is going to decrease blood pressure and blood flow in the head and the upper part of the body. So the baroreceptor reflexes quickly counteract the drop in this pressure. Now that's what happens normally, but sometimes in the elderly, these reflexes operate much more slowly, so we don't quickly fix that decrease in pressure, and this can cause the elderly to have something called hypostatic or orthostatic hypotension, low blood pressure. And this, of course, is when you stand up really rapidly and those baroreceptors don't have time or don't respond as quickly and fix that decrease in pressure to the brain. Chemoreceptors, remember, are sensory receptors that monitor the chemical composition of the blood. These are also going to be located really close to those baroreceptors in the carotid sinus and the arch of the aorta. These chemoreceptors are going to detect changes in the blood of oxygen, CO2, hydrogen ions, so hypoxia, low oxygen, acidosis, increased hydrogen ions, or hypercapnia, excess CO2, stimulate the chemoreceptors, and they send impulses to the cardiovascular system, or the cardiovascular center. The cardiovascular center then is going to increase sympathetic stimulation to arteries and veins and produce vasoconstriction, and that's going to cause an increase in blood pressure. The chemoreceptors are also going to be responsible for providing some input to the respiratory system so that the respiratory system can adjust the rate of breathing to help get in more oxygen and get rid of more CO2. And of course, we know that that is going to help to prevent changes in blood pH as well. So when the heart rate increases rapidly, of course, that's going to increase our cardiac output, but also, and I'm not sure if I said this, so I wanted to run back through it right quickly, this is also going to produce some widespread vasoconstriction, and that in conjunction with that increased cardiac output is going to cause an increase in blood pressure. The cardiovascular system that helps us to regulate blood pressure also receives information from higher brain areas and from sensory receptors. So nerve impulses from the cerebral cortex, the hypothalamus, and the limbic system all can affect the cardiovascular center. For example, think about if you're getting ready to run a race. Your heart rate may increase simply because you're thinking about it. So your limbic system, your emotions about the race, were able to stimulate the cardiovascular system. If your body temperature rises while you're running the race, the hypothalamus can send impulses to the cardiovascular system, and this dilates blood vessels in the skin so that you can sweat more and help to dissipate that heat. So there are other areas of the brain, higher brain areas, that can also affect the cardiovascular center and, of course, then cause vasodilation or vasoconstriction or increase in cardiac stimulation and cardiac output because of your emotions, because of rises in temperature. When you're learning about the endocrine system, you're going to get a lot more on these particular hormones, but there are some hormones that help to regulate blood pressure and blood flow by altering cardiac output, changing peripheral resistance, or adjusting total blood volume by increasing or decreasing the amount of urine output. So these will be discussed in more detail with the endocrine system, but I do want to mention them here because they do play a role in regulation of blood pressure. So we'll look briefly at some of these hormones and how they increase or decrease peripheral resistance. So some of the vasoconstrictors include epi and norepi that can be released by the adrenal glands. So in response to the sympathetic stimulation, the adrenal medulla is going to release epi and norepi. So these hormones increase cardiac output because they increase the way that your heart's beating, right? Your heart starts beating much faster and much harder. By increasing cardiac output, we also know that that is going to increase blood pressure. But they can also cause vasoconstriction of some of the arteries in the skin and the abdominal organs, and vasodilation in the arterioles and cardiac and skeletal muscle, which helps to increase blood flow to those muscles during periods of exercise. When blood volume falls or blood flow to the kidneys decrease, the kidneys can release renin. Renin is going to begin a pathway that activates angiotensin II. Angiotensin raises blood pressure in two ways. First, it's a very powerful vasoconstrictor, so it raises blood pressure by increasing peripheral resistance. Second, it stimulates the release of aldosterone. Aldosterone from the adrenal cortex, we'll talk about in a few minutes, and its role in long-term regulation. And there's also antidiuretic hormone. Again, we'll talk about that in more detail with long-term, but I wanted to mention it here because when ADH is released quickly and in high concentrations, it causes vasoconstriction, and of course vasoconstriction is going to cause an increase in blood pressure. So because of its action as a vasoconstrictor, it is sometimes referred to as vasopressin. Vasodilators are chemicals that are going to cause the lumen to get larger and the smooth muscle relaxes, so it's going to decrease blood pressure because the size of the lumen of the blood vessels have increased. One of the hormones that's important to this is atrial natriuretic peptide. It is a very powerful vasoconstrictor, so it is going to cause a decrease in blood pressure. But again, you know, I'm always talking about words, so let's look at this. What do you recognize here? Well, atrial refers to the atria of the heart. Peptide tells you it's a protein. Uretic, that should tell you something about urine, right? And then you've got natri. Well, you may or may not know what that is, but I'll bet you know that Na is the chemical symbol for sodium. So natrium is sodium. So we've got heart, sodium, P, protein. Making sense now? Yeah, think about it. ANP is a hormone that when it is released, it's going to cause you to excrete more sodium in your urine. So when you excrete more sodium in your urine, you're also going to excrete more water. And when you excrete more water, when you get rid of more water as a waste product, then of course that's going to decrease blood volume. When you decrease blood volume, you decrease blood pressure. So your ANP can decrease vasoconstriction, but it also decreases blood volume. Some of the other chemicals include some inflammatory chemicals, which are a part of the blood pressure autoregulatory changes that we'll look at, and the mechanisms that initiate those changes that we'll look at when we go a little bit further into this particular chapter. But most of these are going to decrease vasoconstriction. Alcohol inhibits antidiuretic hormone. Antidiuretic hormone, remember, is called vasopressin. So if you inhibit vasopressin, you inhibit vasoconstriction. Here we have a negative feedback regulation of blood pressure, taking us back to that cardiovascular vasomotor center and also using the baroreceptors that we talked about. So the stimulus is homeostasis has been disrupted by decreasing blood pressure, which was our controlled condition. So the receptors, the baroreceptors in the carotid sinus and in the aorta, received less stretch. So that means they decrease the rate of their nerve impulses. Oh, sorry about that. Decrease the rate of the nerve impulses that are sent to the control center in the cardiovascular center of the medulla oblongata. Okay, so what's going to happen? We're going to have increased sympathetic, accelerator, decreased parasympathetic, brake stimulation. The adrenal medulla is also going to be stimulated to increase its secretion of epi and norepi, because remember, those are going to increase your cardiac output. So what happens? Your heart starts beating faster, it starts beating harder, stroke volume is increased, so cardiac output increases. Your hormones, your epi and norepi, are going to cause vasoconstriction of some of those systemic blood vessels, so that increases peripheral resistance. So increasing cardiac output, increasing peripheral resistance, caused the response to be increased blood pressure, and that returned our body back to homeostasis when that increased cardiac output got back to normal, so back to the controlled condition of homeostasis. All right, so if you look at this particular graphic, there's a lot going on here, but it's some really good stuff that show you just a summary of factors that affect short-term regulation of blood pressure. So we're looking at mean arterial pressure. Remember, that's the average of the pressure in the arteries. So factors that affect this in the short term are going to be things that increase cardiac output or increase peripheral resistance. So you can walk through this and see that we've talked about all of these at one point or another. So anything that increases blood volume is going to increase the venous return, whether it is venoconstriction and pushing that blood back to the heart, or it's the venous return, skeletal and muscular pumps that are pushing that blood back to the heart, or just more blood. All of that increases venous return. Decreasing your parasympathetic impulses or increasing your sympathetic impulses, increase your stroke volume, increase your heart rate, increase cardiac output, and that's going to increase your blood pressure. When we're looking at peripheral resistance, remember, anything that increases blood viscosity or increases the length of the blood vessels is going to increase peripheral resistance, as does decreasing or vasoconstriction of those blood vessels, increasing resistance and increasing mean arterial pressure.